Good afternoon, everyone. My name is McKenna Sturgeon. I am the Colorado Municipal League's Training and Marketing Specialist. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to the second installment of our housing webinar series. Today, we are focusing on housing needs assessments. We're joined by Heidi Agler, Managing Director of Root Policy Research. She will discuss how to scope a study, best practices in drafting RFPs, reasonable cost of assessments, and much more. So for now, before we go ahead and get started, I just want to give you a rundown of GoToWebinar if you're new to this. You should see a control panel to the right of your screen. That's where you're going to be able to ask questions. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and I will be monitoring those and making sure that you get those answered. We will also be following up if we run out of time. So please go ahead and ask and we'll get to you. If not right now, at some point, I promise. And this is also being recorded. So tomorrow we will follow up with a link to the recording as well as the presentation material. So you have access to that afterward as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Heidi.
Great, thank you so much, McKenna. Welcome to a discussion about housing needs assessments. I'm Heidi Agler. I am with a Denver-owned business called Root Policy Research. Go ahead and advance the slide. Thank you. We were founded about 4 years ago to advance economic consulting and policy analysis in many of the areas that we believe are critical to the development of thriving communities. Most of our work is in the housing realm, although we do a bit of work in economic mobility, mostly around childcare and early education and some community development work. I've done this work for well over 20 years. I've done this work in Colorado for over 20 years. I came to Colorado from Minneapolis, where I was an economic analyst with the Federal Reserve. We are a women-owned business. We office in East Denver. My office is right on Colfax, which is both humbling as well as entertaining some days. And we work all throughout the country. So even though we've done a lot of work, we do a lot of work in the Mountain West. We've done work, as you can kind of see in the map here, in about half of the states in the country. Go ahead and go forward. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about housing needs assessments. My presentation is really tailored to those early stages of thinking about completing a housing needs assessment, and I'll talk a bit about strategy development as well. I believe we have a pretty diverse group of representative communities on this session, and so feel free, if I'm not getting specific enough for your community, if you have really specific questions, I'm allowing plenty of time for question and answers today. So go ahead and pop that in the question, and then we'll take questions when I get through with the presentation. So my agenda today, I'm going to talk first about what an HNA is, the key components of a housing needs assessment. Sometimes we refer to this as a housing market analysis as well. There's not really too much distinction between the two. Sometimes a housing market analysis is more site specific. So if you're thinking about doing a development on a corridor on the site, you may focus more on the market aspect of that. So I'll talk broadly about HNAs, about scoping, what if I were in your shoes, would consider. Talk a bit about RFP drafting and consultant selection. On that end, I am a consultant, so I'm speaking from the perspective of a consultant, but I've really thought about putting on my public sector hat when drafting that part of the presentation. I'm a former member of the Denver Planning Board, and so I was in another seat at one point in my life and saw a product come to us and had the experience of thinking about when reviewing a consultant report, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and what would I have liked to have seen to help make a better decision. I'll talk a bit about costs and what staff should expect when using a consultant. If you want to do an HNA on your own, what resources are available to you. Talk a bit about community engagement as well as advisory committee pros and cons. We find ourselves these days working with a lot more committees than we have in the past that communities have arranged to guide their HNAs. And I'm going to conclude with a bit about strategy development. Again, an area where we've been more frequently operating than in the past. I wanted to start with a question of why you should do an HNA, and I think about this a lot. So what are you trying to answer by completing an HNA? And the first question you should ask is, why does our community have housing needs? These are the big economic reasons why Colorado in particular is finding itself in a really tough situation in trying to accommodate the growing population and growing workforce. The one aspect is that housing is very dynamic. It's closely tied to many aspects of the economy. The big one that's been in the news a lot is interest rates. So it's not a single commodity. I'm not making something and selling. If I were making something and selling it, I would have more control, in theory, over the ingredients of that product. But I don't have a lot of control over all of the ingredients that go into making housing. Housing is impacted by global commodities, investors, and markets, I think, as we've seen more directly in the last couple of years than ever before. But at the same time, it's also fundamentally local. So getting the right match of supply, demand, and a price point is a real challenge for local communities, but it's really what they're striving for when thinking about doing a housing needs assessment and developing a strategy. I think it goes without saying that supply isn't expanding fast enough. Why is that happening? And that's because, again, the physical demand of housing, so all the ingredients that go into producing housing, those lag considerably behind the factors that create demand, which is a person moves into a community, a worker moves into a community because they got recently hired. That could happen within a week, whereas the development of a housing unit to accommodate them may take 6 months or longer if you're starting from scratch from that approval process within a community. Construction and labor costs are very high on the construction end associated with the supply chain. We're also building nicer housing than we've ever built. We have higher standards. That's not to say we should lower those, but it's just certainly a recognition that we're building better stuff typically. Labor costs are up largely because the relatively inexpensive construction labor that communities were benefiting from in the early 2000s left the state. They left the state to move back to other countries. They left the state to move to more active markets such as Texas, and they have not come back. So it's really hard to find labor, particularly in more rural areas where you're needing to draw on labor from other states or from urban areas. And then the regulatory environment, and that's something that you all should look at as part of your housing needs assessment. The other thing I would just notice is, I think that part of our problem is that we as a community, not just Colorado, but the United States in general, didn't ever really think about housing as being a long-term investment. For many years, housing was a programmatic solution. So we gave subsidies to people who were poor, who needed assistance to be able to avoid homelessness, who were housing unstable, but didn't think strategically outside of very high-cost markets, and there used to only be a handful of them, about how to manage housing needs over the long term and how to manage housing needs over economic cycles. So we call this commitment issues, sort of sarcastically within our firm. The federal government, neither the federal government, really honestly, nor very many states or localities have really thought about housing as a long-term investment. And go forward. Components of housing needs assessment. These are the basic things that you all should see in a housing needs assessment. Typically, housing needs assessments start with a demographic analysis. If you're a planner, you might think of that as an existing condition scan. So who lives in your community? Who's likely to move to your community? Who's moved out of your community over time? Those aspects draw heavily on state demographic data, which in Colorado is very good. Economic profile, what jobs are expected to be growing in your community, how much are those workers paid, and how does that match what type of housing you have available? And then the commuting question, I think, is a really curious one. How bad is your commuting situation? So what proportion of your workers can you house? How has that changed over time? that bigger picture in terms of policy issues, what is your tolerance for commuting? So you're probably not going to address the entirety of your in-commuting problem with a housing strategy, but you need to think about what your target would be. Do you want to really, really solve your in-commuting challenge, or is that something that would be a nice benefit, but is not really the core aspect of your housing needs assessment? In terms of housing supply, we typically look at your unit types and trends. I can tell you that most Colorado communities build a lot of single-family detached housing and built a lot of multifamily housing prior to the Great Recession. That market is bouncing back, but for quite a while, there wasn't a whole lot of multifamily construction outside of the city and county of Denver or the Front Range. But the city and county of Denver really was the only jurisdiction for many years that was actively permitting and producing multifamily housing. A vacancy analysis, we're looking a little more specifically these days on short-term rentals, both in rural resorts, rural areas, and urban areas. How much of your vacant units are occupied, if you will, or reserved for short-term and vacation rental? One of our staff, Avilia Bueno, who is an economist, did an analysis last year of the state housing supply. We looked at the change in housing units per household over time, and we looked at that after removing units that we believed were reserved for short-term or vacation rental based on census data, and those numbers changed quite a bit. So the short story is the state overall is very behind in production, even if you're counting those units as housing permanent residents. But if you take them out, you can see how severe that lag in production has been over the last few years. Building permit analysis tells you what to expect coming online, both in terms of housing type and what those units, who those units may accommodate. Then we shift and we do a rental and assisted housing analysis, looking at what units are available to low-income people, what a community's share is of those units relative to surrounding areas and the regions overall. And then for sale housing, because we honestly, typically have better data, we have parcel by parcel data or unit by unit data. For sale housing, we can do more GIS analysis. So looking at the location of units for sale by price point. For some communities, we can match that to workforce salaries to really understand, as you think forward in terms of your job growth, where are people going to be able to afford to buy homes? Go ahead and go forward. Then we typically shift to a housing affordability analysis. So this is the data on what things cost. This looks at price trends, gaps between inventory and demand, and projected affordability by unit type. A couple of years ago for the city of Boulder, we looked at two different types of households, a single-person household and a three-person household. We looked at, from a for sale perspective, what was affordable for them to buy right now in terms of inventory, so single family detached, townhome, condo, and then we looked at their projected wage growth based on historical wage growth for that type of household compared to the projected price growth based on historical price growth for those units to see where those gaps would widen, if they would. And to answer the question of, for that three-person household making X amount of money, what could they possibly buy in the future? And you can see, in this case, that townhomes became less affordable without some kind of subsidy, and maybe the only thing that they could buy is a condo under certain circumstances. So when you're thinking about projections and asking your consultants about projections, think about exactly what questions you'd like to answer. We've also been doing a lot more what I'll call subpopulation analysis. The biggest thing that stands out is homeownership gaps by race and ethnicity. Many residents in your communities will have disproportionate housing needs, and there's a lot of reasons for those. The main reason is typically, historically, certain populations have been denied wealth accumulation over time. Much of that is linked to not being able to buy housing, particularly, and accumulate that assistance, that stability from their family over time because of discrimination in the market. We also look at incomes relative to what housing is selling for in this home ownership gap. So where do your subpopulations fall in terms of income brackets, and how likely is it that they could afford a home, or what is the differential in down payment assistance to get people into home ownership? As I said, we do that a lot by race and ethnicity, but looking at that by disability, by household status, particularly with single parents, would be something else that I would consider. And then the recommendations, I would say, is where there's the most variance in what you need to ask your consultant for and how you need to draft that RFP. So there's a lot of I would say considerable differences in what communities that we're working with would like to see as part of those recommendations. Sometimes that takes the form of a very comprehensive best practices analysis of peer communities, short-term actions, long-term strategies, as well as for some communities, we'll look at what can we expect in terms of outcomes and what indicators should we monitor for our progress. But again, those are very specific pieces of the recommendation section that you need to think about in advance before drafting the RFP, because they're very nuanced, and I would think of those as product add-ons to a typical HNA. So the one thing, speaking of add-ons, that I also wanted to talk about were two things. One is an analysis of different product types and what those might return for your community in terms of affordability. This graphic here, and I know it's a little hard to see, but we'll send out the presentation so you can see it in more, or see it a little bit closer. We did a study for Tacoma, Washington about 1.5 years ago. They had done a housing needs assessment. The Northwest works a little bit differently than Colorado communities in that they have more requirements around what their housing study looks like. They have to plan for growth. They have to have a growth strategy and the ability to respond to that. And then they need to think about housing types a little more specifically than we typically do in Colorado. So we did an economic feasibility analysis where we looked at, this is an infill, low density infill and zoning reform project. And so we understood, we knew we started with what their housing needs were because other consultants had done that. We took a look at what they could possibly achieve through land use and zoning reform in terms of missing middle products. So this graphic here shows the results of the modeling effort that we did, where we asked, what is it going to cost to build a townhome? What is your gap, the identified gap for rental and for sale housing in terms of AMI? And how much of that activity through zoning and land use reform do you need to be able to meet the needs of your growing population and growing workforce? So this graphic here just matches policy options through zoning and land use reform, as well as some programmatic options with where the needs are in terms of AMI. And AMI is area median income for those of you for whom these acronyms are sort of not familiar on a regular basis. The other thing I'll talk about in just a moment is data dashboards for internal or external use. A lot of clients are asking us to take the data that we assemble in Excel, so we typically work in Excel as well as statistical programs, and turn those into models that they can use actively when they're doing policy planning or online. They make these available online. The city of Denver has done this for many, many years. More communities are starting to use what's called Power BI, so an online software to show and let people better understand both production by type, how a community is meeting affordability goals, as well as what the needs may be in their neighborhood or their sub area. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, which is the third bullet here, is, or the third and fourth bullet, doing an analysis of density bonuses or anything associated with inclusionary housing. These are separate studies. You could add these on to a housing needs assessment, but your typical housing needs assessment is not going to have the economic modeling associated to understand what the value of a density bonus or other types of like fast tracking or parking reduction policies analyses would be. Those are different economic exercises, and a housing needs assessment does not typically give you the information that you need to structure an inclusionary housing policy, or if you're thinking about doing a linkage fee, that's also a separate study. So some of those studies, like a linkage fee, would have a legal requirement that needs to be considered when you're scoping that study. For inclusionary housing, that again, like the density bonus, is more of an economic model that we build. But the HNA should be done first, so prior to both of those, so that you understand what your needs are going in to those analyses. And this next slide just gives you an example of, we've done built housing data dashboards for a really long time for the city of Austin and Travis County. And this latest one, what they've done is they're able to, the geographic level is zip code, which they use to think of as their neighborhoods. And so they can pick a zip code and they can see how that zip code compares with their community overall. The first dashboard that we developed, which gosh, may have been a decade ago, they took and they matched that to, they have a city demographer, they matched that to projected population growth, to workforce growth, and to available land to be able to accommodate those gaps. That then led them to do have a targeted conversation about rezoning. So a community that was going to get a lot of employment growth because maybe there was an Amazon headquarters going in nearby, but didn't have much multifamily housing. In that case, that neighborhood, they would rethink rezoning to be able to respond to that economic growth. So that's how Austin has used the data dashboards. I'm going to shift and talk about the consultant perspective, the consultant selection, and so put on a different hat, a little bit of a different perspective. And this is my observation based on operating in the consulting space, but also who I see active in these communities, and what to think about when you're hiring a consultant is my goal for today. So when you start to think about who should we hire for the housing needs assessment, in my opinion, consultants typically fall into, I have 4 categories here, although there's some blending of those categories. The first is a boutique firm or a sole proprietor that specializes in housing market studies and needs assessments. We have quite a few of those in Colorado. For the size of our state, we're unusual in that we've had some very specialized small firms do this kind of work for a very long time, and the people who do this work in Colorado are generally very knowledgeable. These firms like mine typically have staff that are trained as economists, policy analysts, community planners. Some of those firms, and these are typically sole proprietors, will do those site-specific analyses that are required for low-income housing tax credit applications. But that's not the same as a housing needs assessment. If you did a housing needs assessment, unless you have a special add-on for a site-specific analysis, you're not going to get that out of your HNA. Other firms that are more active in this space are what we would traditionally call planning firms. I would say that for my firm, we have a couple of certified planners, but to be a consultant operating in the housing needs space, you don't have to be certified. As an economist operating in that space, you don't need to be certified. Whereas with a planning firm, you're typically getting somebody who as a certified planner. These would be firms who do a lot of comprehensive planning or general plans, also write code, and operate in the housing needs assessment space. They're typically have fewer economists or policy analysts and more certified planners in those firms. Advocacy organizations and nonprofits often do this work, particularly when it's federally required. They occupy a lot of that space. And for those of you, I don't think there's a lot of entitlement communities on this call, but if you're receiving HUD, or on this meeting, if you're receiving HUD dollars directly from the federal government, you may want to pair your HUD requirement with your housing needs assessment. There's a lot of overlap there. And in some cases, and we don't see this in Colorado as much, but I do see it around the country, when there's a fair housing analysis or requirement to get those HUD dollars, and if your community has a challenging past with fair housing. Many of those communities will hire advocacy organizations who specialize in fair housing. It's a little bit of a safer bet in terms of getting the analysis that you need to be able to, wrong maybe or right some of the wrongs. Design, engineering, and architectural firms are also more active in this space than I've ever seen them. Those types of firms would have more design capabilities, more GIS analysis like planning firms have. And so if you're thinking of pairing your housing needs assessment with like a site plan, for example, a design and engineering or architecture firm would be a logical hire. When you think about who you're going to reach out to send those RFPs out, I'd be more strategic. A lot of communities put it on BidNet, and you get a wide variety of these types of firms that'll pull it down. I think it would behoove you to be a little more strategic and think about what's my desired product, and what type of firm would really be ideal for me to do this. I'm going to talk about the questions that you hope to have answered in just a moment. I also think, and I know there's some lawyers on this call, so ask your purchasing department and ask your city lawyers rather than listen to me in this regard. But if you do have a firm in mind, I do think it's useful to give them a heads up that you might be contracting for an HNA and when, so you can make sure they bid on that. This is a housing needs assessments. There's a lot of work in this field right now, and would probably argue a shortage of contractors. So you may get a better product if you have a more generous time frame under which to complete the study, or you kind of have an idea of the types of firms that you'd like to reach out to. So a couple of just tips in terms of getting a better product, and this falls under the category of just being honest with consultants that you contact for proposals and interviews. If you have a consultant or a group of consultants in mind who you'd like to have propose on the study, I would offer a request for qualifications rather than a request for proposal. It's much easier for a consulting team to prepare those, and it'll give you sort of a first cut idea of, you can ask some strategic questions. How busy are these teams? Thinking back to like the product that we want, what we really want out of the study, have they done that kind of work in the past? I might do a first cut of an RFQ and then ask for specific scopes from those consultants who seem like logical choices to do the work. If you don't have a consultant or a type of consultant in mind, I would be as precise as you can in the request for proposals, work about the desired scope. So we'll see RFPs of all types. Some have very, very specific questions. Others have basic information about a housing needs assessment. The latter communities are just a little bit harder to work for. It's harder to respond to the RFP, but those communities may be a little hard to work for in that it's signaling to us they may not know what they need. And if we have to do a lot more of that work kind of on the front end, the product's just going to be more expensive. You can tell me exactly what you want me to do and the questions that you want answered. I can be far more efficient. I can write you a better proposal, and you're just going to have a better product at the end of the day. I know that's really idealistic, but in terms of getting the best product, the closer you can get to that, the better off you'll be. The other thing I just wanted to mention, because this seems to be, or at least we've had this experience, and it seems to be a little more common than I've seen it in the past, is in interviews asking mostly the same questions of all consultants with a few questions tailored to their proposal responses. People are really busy right now, and we've found that the interviews, particularly virtually, have been a little more informal than in the past. And I think just purely from a procurement perspective, making sure that you are asking the same questions is just a really good idea. Also, don't pre-screen some consultants or others. You don't know, you don't want to get yourself in trouble, and you don't know if there's any differences in leadership or ownership by gender, race, or ethnic composition of those firms. And it's just a good idea to treat everybody the same and be very fair, even if it takes more time on your end. So questions to ask to ensure the best consultants. I try to put myself in your shoes and asked myself, quite honestly, what are the hardest questions for us to answer, or what are the questions that I would want to know? And I think these are all very fair, and they're questions that consultants who you hire should answer really well. So who in your firm will be working on this project? A lot of times we will get questions around, what work do you have in the next 6 months? And that's a really easy question for me to answer, but it doesn't really get at the question that you all should have, which is, are you going to be attentive to my project? Are you going to respond to emails? Are you going to leave everything until the last minute and then I'm going to get a whole bunch of product at once? I want to know who's going to work on this, who's going to manage the project, if they're a good fit with my public sector project manager, and what their experience is. What is the most successful housing needs assessment you've completed and why? And what types have been challenging and why? And the second question I think is very fair, and you should get an honest answer from your consultants. Not all of these projects are easy to do. Sometimes politics really gets in the way of coming up with good recommendations and strategies. And I think hearing from your potential consultants on what that might look like and how they dealt with those tricky situations is a really good thing to know. What questions do you have about the scope? We have to complete it. We hope to have completed. I don't know that anybody's ever asked me this question directly, and I think it's a really good one. It'll give you a sense of how well your consultant understands what you're asking them to do and when there may be problems with it. How often will we engage with you during the project? And what is your firm culture and how do you promote equity in hiring and staff retention? I have never gotten that last question, and I think it's a really good one. A lot of times the success of these projects really depends on the relationship between the public sector and the consultant, and different people work better with other types of people. And so getting really comfortable, particularly these days when there's so much politics in making housing decisions, understanding and having faith in your consultant and really having a great partnership, I think is imperative in getting a good product. I'm going to shift and talk a bit about scoping and RFP drafting. So we've had a couple clients who have done this, and I think I'm borrowing from their successes. I think it's really, really good to first understand how well does your leadership understand housing policy. If you have the opportunity to do one-on-ones with your counselors or commissioners before you scope the study, I would absolutely do that. That will tell you if they understand what housing is, kind of if they're what place they are starting in terms of this discussion. If you need to ask your consultant to do a one-on-one on them or one-on-one with them, inevitably what happens is that you'll have one or two commissioners or counselors who really get this stuff and others do not. It's complicated and it might put the others on defense, which just makes it a little hard to craft meaningful policies. So, start with what your leadership knows, and you need to tailor aspects of that scope to getting everybody kind of on the same page. The second question I would say is the most important one and probably the hardest one to do or to ask of really, really busy staff and communities right now. What questions ideally do you want answered? I would hold a brainstorming session, both with people who are on the front lines, who are getting those calls. I'm about to be evicted. What do I do? Who do I call? To your senior planner who's getting pressure to figure out how do we think about encouraging affordable housing products through our code, so that you understand the range of what you'd like answered in the study. When we think about a very, if you're just to put together a very sort of broad and standard scope for a housing needs assessment, you will get data tables and maps and a lot of information, but I can guarantee you it may or may not answer the questions that you have. So really pushing your consultants to take that next step and doing analysis that is targeted to get to what you want to know. That alone will make or break, the success of a study. And then capacity, inevitably we get to the recommendations phase and we can come up with the best recommendations in the world, and our clients will say, we have no staff to implement that. Thinking about what can we do now and what can we do in the future is the way that I would think about it. So a lot of times we'll structure our strategic plan discussions as easy wins to shoot for the moon. Those easy wins are things that, gosh, you know, we really probably should have done this. This is an easy fix, or this is something we absolutely have to do. Our inclusionary zoning policy is not working. Our density bonus policy isn't working. We've got, you know, some funky stuff in our code that may have a disparate impact that we need to correct. Get those done first and foremost, and then you have the ability to build capacity to do those long range recommendations. But going into that kind of before maybe you craft the RFP so that you can talk about, you desire those solutions as part of the process, but certainly before you kick off the study, and sharing that information with your consultant, I think is really important. The other question that I would ask is, what are we going to do with this information where we have it? And this gives you, I think, or I would hope, the ability to step out of the analysis paralysis space. So a lot of us who do this work, or who are interested in doing this work, we love data. We love to think about how we can cross data to look at this or that. And it's really easy to get down a rabbit hole and then think about, well, I don't even really know what this data means. So a lot of times we'll have clients ask us for information that's really interesting, that maybe city leadership asked for, but at the end of the day, doesn't really lend you much in terms of a strategy or action plan. So think about, when you're putting like the data elements in your RFP, what do we do? What would we do with the information if we had it? And some examples of requests that we get that are pretty common these days, that are sometimes hard to produce. So it's hard to get the answers to these because of limitations in data, but really beg the question of, what are you going to do with the data if you have it? Are segments of the population with different demographics or different financial situations competing for the same types of homes? A real estate, somebody who's analyzed real estate transactions, a realtor can tell me that. It might be anecdotal, but they would have a good sense of that. It's really hard for me to pull that out of data unless I'm doing a resident survey, and even so, it's pretty expensive. Are out-of-state investors buying homes? I can do an analysis of assessors data. That might be useful, you know, for some policies, but really think about, what are you trying to achieve from that? You can't prevent, because the Interstate Commerce Act, you can't prevent people from buying in your community. You can't say they can't do that. So think about the legal side of things as well, and what you're actually really going to do with that information. And then, what are gaps by household size versus unit size? This is probably the most common question that we get. There was a very interesting study done by Harvard, by their Joint Center, probably about 5 years ago. They used a subset of, it's actually the actual data out of the census called PUMS, to answer the question of, are our larger units that are really meant to be occupied by families being occupied by households that are smaller, that don't need all that space, that are higher income, or that may have, you know, kind of roommates rotating through. It's a very complicated exercise. It's hard to figure that out, and you have to make a lot of assumptions along the way. What's the most appropriate sized unit? Maybe for an empty nester, do I really want to force them into a smaller, well, I can't really force them, but do I want to think of them or hope that they would move into a smaller unit when maybe that's not what their preference is? So this data exercise, I don't think always yields information that's really actionable, and I would think that about any specific question or data ask, both in the scoping, in the RFP drafting, and certainly when you're engaging with your consultant. So just, I think the best recommendation for RFP drafting is this. If there's a study that you like, reach out to the community who did it, ask for the components of that RFP, and model your RFP after that. The second bullet here, and I know a lot of this is out of your control, but I have a fixed amount of time, and most consulting firms do. Bigger firms will have marketing departments, and that's their job to respond to RFPs. That's not the case with a lot of the smaller firms. So we have fixed amount of time to respond to RFPs and still produce enough billable work to be able to pay everybody's salaries. If you can minimize forms, administrative requirements, and not require a hard copy submission, that saves me a lot of time in putting together the RFP, and I can tailor my scope and tailor my qualifications to what I think your needs are. So you're basically going to get a better product if you're not asking me to spend 60% of the time on forms. And I know that's kind of an idealistic thing to do, but if you can talk to your procurement department, sometimes we see RFPs that are really tailored to construction products and don't have a lot of relevant information for what we do. And then strike a balance in the scope of work response. So I think what you want to do is get enough information that you understand how the consultant would address what you're asking for. But when you ask them for what would your methodology be, what would your formula be, what kind of data would they use, we're kind of reticent to provide that information because sometimes it's proprietary. I have had cases where we responded with that information and the public sector turned around and turned that over to a different consultant, and they then use that methodology. So just to alert you to, there is some sensitivity and some strategy on a consultant's end with providing that information. The big question on expected cost and staff commitment, this will give you a sense of the range of costs that we typically see and what I would expect housing needs assessments to cost. I would say right now in particular, because of the variety of add-ons that we're seeing and that there is money available to do these things, the numbers may be lower and higher than what I've put in here. This is just what I think would be reasonable cost to see from consultants. So if you're asking a base level analysis, I'd like to know demographic trends, housing supply, demand and needs. I'd like this for existing residents, future, and commuters, so a little bit of projections there, some housing gaps, no community engagement. This is a data exercise. I want you to answer my specific data questions. That should be about 40,000. When we start to think about engagement, I'm going to talk more specifically about that in a moment. That can get really expensive really fast. And so, your base engagement should be what we call stakeholder outreach. And that means you're talking to key people in the industry. I'm talking to developers. I'm talking to advocates. I'm talking to real estate professionals. I'm talking to, if I have a subpopulation analysis, Center for Independent Living, for example. I'm talking to people who work with people experiencing homelessness to understand those needs. We typically do that in the form of focus groups or interviews. It can be expensive to do those, a little cheaper virtually right now, but I would add, maybe an extra 35 to do a robust stakeholder engagement. If you'd like to do more engagement, so resident engagement, focus groups with residents where you compensate them, interviews with stakeholders, as well as online surveys, you're probably looking at about $100,000. If you want extras, so I want to do a statistically significant resident survey, I'd like to do more community or leadership meetings, I'd like land use analysis, probably looking at about 125. So again, this is sort of basic averages. There's a lot of variance in these numbers depending on the specific scope, but this is what you should sort of expect to walk into when you issue an RFP. And then in terms of staff commitment, this is a really good question we get all the time in interviews and all the time in RFPs. This is sort of our baseline, what we ask of staff, but honestly, it really varies as you get to know the staff, as you're going through the process and you kind of jointly figure out what's the best relationship to have, both from check-ins to, strategizing around or troubleshooting, or jointly presenting at the end of the study. Really where sort of the staff commitment is the highest, I would say, is the beginning and the end. The scoping and community engagement is pretty heavy lift on the front end, and asking and providing data, or us asking for, responding to data requests. Mid-study should really just be progress meetings. Things should be working pretty well. And then the end of the study, and this is where I would leave, I think there's it's seldom that there's left enough time to review the sections in a timely manner, have a strategy workshop. What are you going to do with this information? What makes sense? And then promote the final study. If I were to, and actually the City of Pueblo did a really good job, I think about maybe it was in the fall or winter, of engaging in a lot of I think, very appropriate promotion of their study. There were a number of articles as well as some radio reports, radio interviews around what they had done. If I were to allocate the most time, if I'm thinking about staff commitment, I would probably allocate at least 40%, maybe 50% to that end of study work. That's how to get the best product, really look at that product and review it closely, respond quickly to your consultants about changes, and then engage in a very intentional strategy development. If this is something that you want to do on your own, there are, go ahead and go forward. There's a lot more information out there than there ever has been. I would point everybody to the Local Housing Solutions website. This was a joint project that was developed by, it's very urban in nature, but it'll give you a lot of really good information about how to think about a strategy, what kind of data are available, what you might want to build into your RFP in terms of consultant analysis of potential solutions. This was developed by the Furman Institute at New York University and Apt Associates. It's a very large consulting firm. We work with them on and off over time, but it's a really, really nice and very well organized website. For those of you who want to understand inequities in your community, the first link, which is the HUD AFFT or AFFHT link, it's a pretty user-friendly website that'll give you a sense of, and if you're not an entitlement community, you can pull down the county, or even there's a state version, and just zero in on, it's a GIS-based software system. Just zone in on your community, understand where rental housing is, where people with significant housing needs are concentrated. That'll kind of give you a sense at the neighborhood or sub-area level what you might want to focus on. So I'm going to talk a bit about community engagement and then strategy, and then we can take questions. Just key considerations in community engagement, thinking about, and this is hard, I think, for everybody to understand until you're in it, what is going to be successful. For residents, there's a number of options that we typically use. I'll call the first two market research approaches. Sometimes we professionally recruit focus groups to reach target populations. We pay people for their time. We gather off-site. We ask them hard questions about their experience in finding housing. The first two we typically do without clients being present, so that people can talk really honestly about their experience. An online or paper survey distributed through partners. The first one we typically do without clients. The second one, a statistically significant survey. That's where you would use a random sample. We hire professional firms to call landlines and cell phones and administer a survey that we work with our clients to develop. If you want to understand what people's housing preferences are, which is a little bit different than needs, then I would recommend using that approach. Those surveys are very expensive to administer and analyze. It's probably a $40,000 commitment in that administration of the survey, development and administration of the survey, not counting the analysis. But if you have a council who wants statistically significant data in terms of what preferences are, what needs are, and they're going to grill you on that information, that's something to think about if you have the resources. Online or paper survey, we typically distribute those through partners to trusted networks, so community navigators. It's not statistically significant. We've had success using public housing authorities to distribute those surveys. We do those when we want targeted low-income populations represented to understand what their needs are. And then community meetings. I just threw a link in here to some really fun community meetings that we did for a regional fair housing study in Denver. We brought in, hired artists, community, they did community performances, they danced, they did poetry to staff those meetings. And it attracted, I would definitely say, a different group of residents with needs than a typical community meeting. So if you have the resources, that's certainly a way to go. Stakeholder engagement, I talked a little bit about this on the advisory committee or working group. I would just definitely say, know what you want out of an advisory committee or working group before you step into that territory. A lot of times advisory committees are there to truly advise. They're not voting on anything. Sometimes it's a political strategy so that when you're bringing your study to council, they see that people who were in the industries that they represent had a say in the development of the plan. For a survey, we don't do a ton of stakeholder surveys unless we're doing HUD entitlement work, because it typically doesn't yield the information you need for an HNA. It's really good to ask stakeholders, however, about resources. So how would they prioritize resource allocations? And then this next slide just gives you an example of some of the successes we use. This was in the Baltimore area, working through a public housing authority. We didn't do a statistically significant survey there, but we worked through the PHA to get to residents who had the most needs, and we had a really, really strong success. So that's another route if you have a good relationship with your PHA. And then I'm going to conclude with the difference between a strategy and action items and recommendations. When we think about common approaches to address affordable housing needs in our firm, we typically put them in 3 buckets: deregulation, regulation, or subsidies. And I think that a good strategy should have a little bit of both. The other way to think about this is programmatic versus policy items. So programmatic solutions are generally things that help people with the most significant needs that you can execute or may actually have already in process in a community, and you're really being very responsive to the needs today. Policy solutions, I would say, have more of a long-term view. How can we catalyze private sector development to build some workforce housing? Where are our policies broken in that we're, like land use and zoning policies, we're not building the kind of housing to achieve true equity in our communities? Those are more long-term thinking around recommendations and things that I would make sure that you're asking the right data and information out of your HNA to be able to inform. In thinking about a strategy and how that differs from programmatic solutions, I really like these quotes that I borrowed from a strategic planning consultant, private sector, a non-housing strategic planning consultant recently. You're thinking about, how do I direct resources? How do I leverage resources? How do I pivot? What should my community be doing entirely differently to ensure better value to my community in terms of housing provision? And then again, if you have resources coming, or you may be enacting a fee in lieu and you think you're going to have the ability to catalyze development and to incentivize them to do something differently, or to actually turn around and give money to partners to develop housing, that should be part of your strategy too. And last but not least, in thinking about how to develop that strategy, so your consultant may provide you with recommendations, and then you might go into a strategy workshop phase where you think about, what do these make sense for us? What are short-term? What are long-term actions? I would define the problem, think about what problems you really want to respond to, or what challenges can your community really respond to, looking at the factors that are contributing to those challenges, and then narrowing what you can do today and in the future, deciding what you want to prioritize, and then crafting a clear plan with adequate resources to go forward. So this is typically, like, this kind of workshop is something that's typically an add-on with HNAs. I think without it, quite honestly, you're more likely to fall into the kind of the programmatic solution space and not necessarily the policy solution space. So getting a strategy done is really hard. It takes a lot of time, thinking back to that sort of what happens at the very end of an HNA. But I'm becoming a bigger fan of investing in that if you really want to move the needle. And with that, that is my last slide. It took a little longer than I wanted, and I'd be happy to answer questions that I think McKenna might be tracking, or feel free to put those in the question box now, and we'll entertain those in the last couple minutes.
We have had one come through that asks, how often should a community revisit an existing assessment?
Yeah, that's a really great question. What we typically see, so there are many states that require housing needs assessments, or they require a more specific scope than what is typically in a comprehensive planning document. And between 5 to 8 years is typically when we see those updated, and those typically align with the planning requirements the states impose. I don't know that I've seen any that is less than 5 years that would be on a 3-year cycle. So 5 to 8. 5 is probably the sweet spot. I think things change enough that you need more information. 8's maybe a little bit of a long cycle to really adequately respond to changing needs.
Wonderful.
Oh, sorry, this goes without saying, but if you're an entitlement community and you're doing you're required to do a report for your HUD consolidated plan, even though these are different, pulling a lot of the same data. So I would do a housing needs assessment, focus my resources on a housing needs assessment, and then update that regulatory document before. So I might start my HNA, and those are typically 5-year cycles. I might start my HNA 18 months before my HUD report is due, and that gives you adequate time to get through that HNA process and the regulatory process.
Awesome. Thank you. And just a reminder for folks, if you do have questions, go ahead and just type them into that questions panel, and I can read those out for you. So the next question asks, do housing needs assessments typically include a land use capacity analysis? For example, how would I know how much land is needed to meet future housing needs?
Your standard housing needs assessment does not. If you want a land use capacity analysis, be sure to put that in the study. I think that's something that is an excellent add-on. It would require typically a partnership with a firm that specializes in housing and a firm that specializes in GIS analysis and planning. So you might you may get a partnership, like a lead firm with a subcontractor who would do that analysis in that case.
Thank you. And then just a follow-up to your previous questions. How about water capacity?
Boy, that's a great question. I'm working through this right now for a client in New Hampshire, and what we're doing, this is New Hampshire has a workforce housing law, and we're looking at what we would call a fair share allocation. So what's a community's responsibility to build housing to respond to regional needs? In rural, a lot of New Hampshire's rural, in rural New Hampshire, water and sewer capacity are a big deal. And so we are doing a couple things, or we're exploring doing a couple things. We are not doing the water and sewer capacity analysis. Other consultants have done that, and so we're taking that analysis to help us understand how many units could this community, is this community likely to develop over time based on that constraint. The other piece that we're looking at is, because a lot of these communities are sort of resort oriented, very large lot oriented, what could be a reasonable, what would be sort of a reasonable capacity analysis if the community was a little more dense. So there's not really a magic way of doing that. And I recognize this is a really growing a challenge in the West, but it's certainly, I would build that into, if you're worried about those things, build in enough scope in your housing needs analysis that you're taking into account water and sewer capacity as well as that land use capacity.
Thank you. It looks like those are all the questions that we've had come through thus far. And I'll go ahead and turn on my video so everyone can see me while I talk. Thank you so much, Heidi, for all of your time today. We really appreciate it. I sure learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. I'm going to go ahead and send a follow-up email tomorrow with a recording to this video as well as the slides, so you will have access to all of those materials. Heidi will also be copied on that email if you have any follow-up questions. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And just as a reminder, please go ahead and tune in to our next installment of our housing webinar series, which is going to be on May 19th. We're going to be discussing CHAFA's Colorado Affordable Housing Developers Guide. You can register for that at cml.org. So with that, I will let everyone have their afternoon. Again, thank you so much, Heidi.
Thanks for attending, and feel free to follow up with any questions. Have a great week.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.